Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I want to start our time today by asking you to do something for me. Just close your eyes for a second.
Right.
And I want you to picture an ancient religious sacrifice, just whatever comes to mind first.
I'm guessing for most people living in the modern world,
Yeah.
the mind just immediately goes to a very specific, highly cinematic scene.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
You picture this massive stone altar, right? Maybe it is bathed in the eerie light of a full moon.
Yeah. And you have got a group of priests.
Right, draped in dark robes, chanting in some forgotten language.
Yep.
And you picture a terrified animal on the altar.
And hanging over that entire scene is this thick, suffocating atmosphere of guilt and dread and this desperate plea for cosmic atonement.
It feels heavy. I mean, it feels violent.
It feels like a Hollywood blockbuster.
Yeah.
Honestly, the cultural imagination we have inherited is just completely saturated with that specific dramatic framing. We assume the ancient person approached the altar trembling, burdened by their sin, hoping the blood of the animal would somehow balance a cosmic moral scale.
But what if I told you that for the vast majority of the ancient population, none of that was happening?
None of it.
Right. For the average farmer or the local tradesman, there was no trembling, there was no chanting, and there was certainly no agonizing over systemic moral guilt.
It was, for all practical purposes, a neighborhood barbecue.
A barbecue. I mean, think about that. You had a problem, you slaughtered a goat, you cooked the meat, you shared it with your family, and you just left a portion for the local unseen spirits to keep them happy.
That is the reality we are going to uncover today.
Because you are listening to a show designed for people who want to cut through the noise, right? We want to grasp the historical truth without getting bogged down by academic jargon. You are the learner, and we want to give you the ground-level reality of how ancient people actually lived, thought, and worshipped.
And to get to that ground-level reality, we have to recognize a massive historical illusion. I mean, almost everything modern people assume about ancient religious practice comes from a microscopic fraction of ancient writers.
Like how small of a fraction?
We are talking about less than 2% of the population.
Wow, 2%.
Yeah, less than 2%. These were the highly educated, literate elites, the philosophers, the specialized priests, the state-sponsored poets.
Okay, let's unpack this because our mission for this deep dive is ambitious. We are going to completely dismantle modern assumptions about ancient religion.
We really are. And we have a great resource for it.
Yes, we are pulling all of our insights today from a single striking source. It is this brilliant paper by Stanley Stowers. It is titled The Religion of Plant and Animal Offerings versus the Religion of Meanings, Essences, and Textual Mysteries.
Quite the title.
Right. It is published in the book Ancient Mediterranean Sacrifice.
And Stowers provides a paradigm shift that forces us to reevaluate our entire historical framework. We have based our view of the ancient Mediterranean world on the critiques written by the ancient equivalent of cultural snobs.
Cultural snobs, I love that.
Well, it is true. These elites hated mainstream society. But because the literate elite wrote the books, their disdain for the common barbecue became the official historical record.
So to understand what was actually happening, we must stop thinking of religion as one monolithic category.
Right. We cannot assume it is a single umbrella covering both the philosopher in Athens and the illiterate farmer out in the countryside. They are doing totally different things.
Stowers suggests we look at different modes of human activity instead, which brings us to the first major hurdle. This is Stowers' primary critique of modern scholarship. He argues that historians and theologians have spent centuries hunting for the one true meaning of animal sacrifice.
And it is a wild goose chase.
Yeah, they look at all these different cultures, the Greeks, the Romans, the various Mediterranean tribes, and they try to find a single universal symbolic essence that applies to every single sacrificial act across time.
Which is just a product of modern post-Enlightenment thinking. We expect everything to have a neat systematic definition. But Stowers argues we should separate the broad, human, cognitive, practical phenomenon of religion from the concept of a religion.
So let's break that distinction down. The difference between religion as a general human activity and a religion as a specific noun.
So religion with a lowercase r is a broad human activity. It involves the everyday practices, habits, and assumptions people make about non-obvious beings.
The unseen realm.
Right. It is fluid, unbounded, and highly localized. It does not have a strict boundary line. A religion, on the other hand, is a social formation.
So it is claimed and defined by an elite group.
Precisely. Usually through political structures and written texts. They draw a circle and say, this is what we believe, this is our systematic theology, and this is who belongs inside the circle.
And modern scholars look at the unbounded, messy, everyday practices of ancient people and try to force them into that bounded circle to find a tidy, universal meaning.
Which just does not work.
It is like thinking all religious acts across the ancient world have one core meaning, is like trying to find the one single essence of sports.
That is a great analogy.
Right. I mean, you have a guy throwing darts in a pub in London, you have a gymnast competing at the Olympics in Tokyo, and you have a kid kicking a rock down an alley in Chicago. If a historian tried to write a unified theory on the theology of moving physical objects to explain all three of those activities, they would be laughed out of the room.
Nobody would take that seriously.
Because the contexts are completely different. But wait, let me push on this. If there is no universal theological meaning to ancient sacrifice, what actually held these ancient practices together?
This raises an important question. If it was not theology, what was the glue?
Yeah, if the farmer in Greece and the tradesman in Rome did not share a systematic theology, why are they doing such similar things?
The answer is shared, inherited physical practices. The unity was not found in a shared belief system or a creed. It was found in the physical act of doing.
So they shared a set of common practices, inherited from their ancestors, about how to interact with the world and the beings in it.
The physical action was the primary reality. The explanation for the action was secondary, if it even existed at all.
So if theology was not the glue, if it was not about believing the right intellectual concepts, we need to look at what average people were actually doing on a Tuesday in ancient Greece.
We need to look at the default setting of human behavior in that era.
And Stowers calls this first mode the religion of everyday social exchange.
This is the baseline. In this mode, the gods are not viewed as distant cosmic principles. They are not viewed as abstract, moral exemplars holding the universe together.
What are they then?
They are viewed as interested parties. They are local residents who intervene in highly specific, mundane ways in the daily lives of humans.
The source material highlights a fascinating distinction that illustrates this perfectly. Stowers brings up the difference between Zeus of Olympus and a much lesser-known fetish called Zeus of the Possessions.
The contrast between the two is it reveals the entire mindset of the ancient farmer.
So Zeus of Olympus is the one we all know from the mythology books. He is the guy up in the clouds. He brings the rain, he throws the lightning bolts, he manages the macro weather systems.
Right, the big boss.
But Zeus of the Possessions is completely different. The source notes he was represented by a simple jar.
A jar, not a grand statue.
Just a jar. It was kept in a storeroom, and his primary job was keeping mice away from the grain supply.
And the crucial point Stowers makes is that an ancient Greek farmer did not sit around debating whether these two versions of Zeus were manifestations of the same singular deity.
They did not hold theological councils to hammer at the exact nature of the Zeus head.
No, they did not ask how the god of the cosmos could also fit inside a clay jar in a pantry.
They did not care about the theological paradox.
They had no reason to care. They just knew which entity to interact with to achieve a specific goal.
So if you need rain for your crops, you appeal to the cosmic Zeus.
Right. And if you have a rodent problem in your pantry, you go to the jar in the storeroom and interact with Zeus of the Possessions.
Gods were treated like persons. They had minds, they had specific desires, and crucially, they had spatial limitations.
Spatial limitations. That is a huge concept to grasp.
It is entirely counterintuitive to how we think about the divine today. When we read the scriptures, we understand the Lord as omnipresent, filling all in all, not bound by time or space. You were saying these pagan gods were thought of as literally being in one physical place at one specific time and nowhere else.
That is correct. They were localized. They were inhabitants of the environment just as much as an olive tree, a river, or a flock of sheep.
So they basically just part of the landscape.
Yeah. When Greeks laid out new cities, they first had to figure out which deities already belonged to that specific plot of land.
They were negotiating with the local, unseen residents.
Because the gods were not everywhere. They were somewhere.
That localized view creates a very specific psychological state for ancient people. If the gods are limited to a certain space and they have varying moods and desires, the human being is left in a state of perpetual guessing.
And Stowers explains this psychological state, this epistemology of uncertainty, using a brilliant analogy. He says being an ancient person was like being in a many-windowed house with the curtains up after dark.
It is a haunting image.
It is. but highly effective for understanding their daily reality.
Imagine it. You are sitting inside the house, in the light. You know there are entities out there in the dark. You know they are watching you from the outside. But you do not know who is looking through which window at any given moment.
You do not know what their current mood is.
Right. You do not know what they want from you. You just know you are being observed by forces more powerful than yourself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that constant state of uncertainty explains the massive industry of divination in the ancient world.
Divination, let's talk about that.
That feeling of being watched by powerful but unpredictable neighbors makes divination a practical necessity. It was not a fringe, mystical hobby for eccentric people. It was a basic survival skill.
I need to clarify something here because my modern brain hears the word divination, and I immediately think of a fortune teller with a crystal ball.
Like trying to predict the future.
Yeah, trying to see 10 years down the road, but that is not what you were saying they were doing.
You have hit the nail on the head. That is a common misunderstanding. They were not trying to predict distant future events. They were trying to read the current mood of the entities outside the window.
They needed immediate, practical information.
Right. Is the spirit near my field happy today? Will this specific entity curse my harvest if I plant the wheat tomorrow?
Because if they have spatial limits and changing moods, you are desperate for clues. The source brings in quotes from Xenophon and Pindar to illustrate this desperate search.
Pindar is fascinating on this.
Yeah, Pindar writes, "Never yet has anyone who walks upon the earth found a reliable symbol from the gods concerning a future matter."
And then Xenophon, the Greek historian and military commander, talks about the gods giving forewarnings and sacrifices, omens, voices, and dreams.
And Xenophon was a pragmatic military man. He was not a mystic, yet he relied on these signs. They were reading the tea leaves of reality just to figure out the local mood.
They were looking for traces, yes or no answers. Xenophon would literally refuse to march his army if the entrails of a sacrificed sheep did not look right.
Wow, an entire army halted because of a sheep.
To his mind, the entity governing that specific valley was currently hostile, and marching into it would be tactical suicide. The signs were the only way to mitigate the terrifying uncertainty of the many-windowed house.
So if you are sitting in this brightly lit house, hoping the entities in the dark are friendly, how do you actually build a relationship with them?
That is the million-dollar question.
If you cannot speak to them directly and you only have these vague signs, how do you keep things smooth so your crops grow and your family stays healthy?
The primary way to interact with these gods was through practices of generalized reciprocity, especially giving gifts of food.
Food?
Yes, this is the core mechanism of the religion of everyday social exchange.
Generalized reciprocity. Let's differentiate that from how we conduct transactions today, because that distinction is heavily featured in the text.
Well, we operate almost exclusively on market exchange today. Market exchange relies on exact price equivalence.
Right. You give me a cup of coffee, I give you $5.
The ledger is balanced immediately. You do not owe me anything, and I do not owe you anything. The relationship ends the moment the transaction concludes. We can walk away from each other completely clean.
I do not owe the barista a Christmas gift. We are entirely even.
Generalized reciprocity is the exact opposite framework. Reciprocity relies on giving gifts that never quite balance out. The goal is not to clear the ledger.
It is to keep the ledger perpetually slightly unbalanced.
Yes, that lingering imbalance is what ensures an ongoing, permanent relationship.
It is like taking turns paying for lunch with a friend. I buy lunch this week, you say you'll get it next time, you buy it next week, and say I can grab the next one.
You never sit down with a calculator and figure out who owes who $3.50.
Because if we did calculate it to the penny, if the ledger hit absolute zero, the social excuse to meet up disappears. The mild ongoing debt is the social glue.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
But here is my struggle with the text. How does killing an animal fit into this friendly lunch dynamic? Because to a modern mind, slaughtering a goat seems like a massive, dramatic leap from picking up the check at a diner.
The text points out a very blunt reality of ancient life that modern people who buy their meat wrapped in plastic at the grocery store often overlook.
Which is?
You cannot eat a live, uncooked animal.
It sounds almost too obvious when you say it out loud, but it changes the entire visual.
Animal sacrifice, for the average ancient person, was simply a festive meal prepared for special, non-obvious guests.
Let's look at the logic. If the gods had demanded a dead animal in a vacuum, if they just wanted violence, that would not be reciprocity. That would just be destruction.
Right, but the gods provide the fruit of the land. They provide the rain, the grain, the the reproductive health of the livestock.
So the humans take those gifts, prepare them as a meal, and share that meal with the gods. It was a dinner party.
The death of the animal was simply the necessary logistical step to get meat on the table for the feast.
That strips away the Hollywood drama completely. It was a barbecue with the local spirits. You cook the meat, the smoke goes up to the entity, and you and your family eat the rest. It is a shared meal.
But the text also adds nuance here. Not all entities outside the window were friendly. It was not all just passing the brisket to a benevolent neighbor.
While the Olympian gods, or the friendly local agricultural deities, might be treated with festive meals, there were other entities that required a different approach.
We are talking about local spirits, the restless dead, entities known as daemons. These were viewed as volatile, easily offended, and potentially dangerous. If you have a difficult, hostile neighbor, you do not invite them inside for a relaxed dinner party. You leave a peace offering on their porch so they leave your property alone.
This is where we see the concept of appeasement. And normal people were engaging in all sorts of hidden, ad hoc practices to deal with these darker entities.
The text mentions the existence of over 300 curse tablets found in the region of Attica alone. These tablets are fascinating. They give us a direct look into the minds of the common people.
They do. A curse tablet was typically a thin sheet of lead.
Lead, not parchment.
Right, lead. A person would write a specific request or binding spell on it, fold it up, and drive a nail through it. Then they would deposit it in a place associated with the underworld, like a grave or a deep well.
And what is wild is that the people writing these curse tablets are the exact same regular people who are participating in the sunny public festivals during the day.
Oh, absolutely.
They are sharing the festive meal with the city gods at noon and then sneaking around at night writing curses to leverage the darker underground entities against their neighbors. The text notes that many of these tablets were used for mundane rivalries. Someone would write, "Bind the tongue of my opponent in court tomorrow."
Or make my rival's business fail. It was a highly pragmatic, almost mechanical approach to dealing with the unseen world.
It highlights that everyday religion was a toolbox. You use the tool that fit the specific situation. A festive meal for the friendly gods, an appeasement offering for the dangerous ones, and a cursed tablet if you needed to gain an edge in a local dispute.
There was no overarching moral framework dictating that one was holy and the other was sinful. It was purely about managing relationships with the unseen powers.
This system of food exchange, appeasement, and practical management seemed to work perfectly well for the vast majority of people. The farmers felt secure, the local spirits were ostensibly fed, and the social ledger was maintained.
So the massive historical question is this: why did our understanding of sacrifice shift? How did we get from a simple shared meal to a highly intellectual, symbolic ritual? Where did the cinematic, guilt-ridden version come from?
That brings us to Stowers' second mode of ancient religion. This is the realm of the literate cultural producer. This is where the historical disruption happens.
The literate specialist. The text notes this group made up less than 2% of the entire population. Less than 2%.
Yet they're the ones who possessed the incredibly rare skill of high literacy. And because they could read and write, they controlled the permanent historical record.
These specialists enacted a total shift in focus. They moved the attention away from doing physical actions to finding the hidden meaning behind those actions.
Their entire social standing, their livelihood, their political prestige relied on their unique ability to interpret complex written texts.
I want to pause here because a modern listener might naturally assume that the literate specialists simply knew better. Were these specialists just inherently smarter than the illiterate farmers? Is this just a case of an educated class correcting the foolish superstitions of the uneducated masses?
Stowers clarifies this point aggressively. This is not about raw intelligence at all. An illiterate farmer in the ancient world possessed massive amounts of practical, interpretive skill.
They could read subtle changes in the weather. They understood the complex signs of the seasons. They knew the intricacies of agriculture, soil management, and animal husbandry.
Doing all of that without modern technology requires incredible cognitive ability and problem-solving skills.
They were surviving in a brutal environment. You cannot be stupid and keep a farm running through a drought in ancient Greece.
The distinction between the farmer and the specialist is purely about the medium of communication. The specialist relied on text networks.
Texts are a completely different kind of technology.
Well, I should say spot on. Texts are mobile, they cross geographic borders, they are entirely detached from local soil.
A farmer's knowledge is tied intimately to his specific plot of land. He knows how the water flows on his hill. A literate specialist's text, however, can travel to Rome, to Egypt, to Syria, carrying abstract ideas that have nothing to do with the physical dirt.
So the medium itself changes the message. Because a text can travel anywhere, the ideas inside it have to become universal rather than local.
The specialist is playing a totally different game. The text breaks down the field of these literate specialists into two distinct poles. On one side, you have the traditionalists.
These are your famous poets, your dramatists, guys like Homer or Aeschylus.
They relied heavily on public patronage. They needed the city-state or wealthy aristocrats to fund their plays and their poetry.
Because of that funding, they had to keep the crowds and the politicians happy, so they generally supported the traditional civic structures.
The traditionalists might write epic plays where the gods act out grand human dramas on Mount Olympus. And we should note that theatrical version of the gods was not how normal people viewed the local spirits in everyday life.
But the traditionalists were still broadly supportive of the established order. They were not trying to tear down the system of reciprocal sacrifice. They just embellished it for entertainment and civic pride.
But on the other pole, you have the independent entrepreneurs. This is where things get volatile. These are the philosophers, the wandering teachers, the early Orphic sects.
These independent experts did not have state funding. They did not have the security of a public salary.
So to make a name for themselves, to attract wealthy students, they had to be radical disruptors.
They directly criticized the traditional system of reciprocity. They looked at the farmer's barbecue and claimed the gods could not be bribed with a piece of cooked meat.
They argued that the gods wanted something else entirely. They proposed that the divine realm desired inner purity, correct intellectual beliefs, and a philosophical understanding of the cosmos.
This makes sense from a self-preservation standpoint. If the gods just want a barbecue, the farmer does not need the philosopher.
But if the gods want intellectual purity, suddenly the philosopher is the most important man in town. So these literate guys are starting to look down on the farmers. They are rolling their eyes at the simple jar in the storeroom holding Zeus of the possessions.
But here is the mechanism I'm trying to understand. How did they actually change the rules of the game?
Yeah, how does a wandering philosopher with a scroll convince an entire town of farmers that the shared meal they have been practicing for centuries is actually wrong? Why didn't the farmers just ignore them?
They achieved this through a process of translating ritual into enigma.
Translating ritual into enigma.
Yes. They began treating ancient traditions, everyday practices, and physical rituals as puzzles or complex symbols that needed decoding. They introduced the concept of allegory into the religious framework.
And conveniently, decoding that allegory was something only the literate specialists could do.
Yet is the core of their strategy. If the ritual is just a shared meal to maintain a social ledger, anyone can do it. The farmer is self-sufficient.
But if the specialist convinces the public that the ritual is actually a symbolic representation of hidden cosmic truths, then the physical act itself is useless unless you understand the hidden meaning.
And to understand the hidden meaning, you need a specialist to explain it to you.
I love the historical examples the source brings up to show this happening in real time. It mentions Aristophanes, the famous comic playwright of Athens.
Aristophanes is great. He clearly found these independent, literate specialists incredibly annoying, and he mocked them mercilessly on stage.
In his play, The Birds, there is a scene that captures this exact dynamic. A character named Pistheteris is trying to sacrifice a goat to found a new city. He is engaging in the normal, everyday practice of social exchange.
But suddenly, an oracle speaker shows up holding a book of prophecies written by a guy named Basis.
The oracle speaker interrupts the physical ritual and claims that his text forbids the sacrifice. He bases this prohibition on a bizarre symbolic interpretation of the word ater, meaning the lower atmosphere.
It is a brilliant piece of satire. Aristophanes is showing the absurdity of text interrupting physical life.
And in another play, Peace, a character rides a giant dung beetle to heaven, and the specialists of the day would try to allegorically interpret the dung beetle as a representation of a specific politician.
Aristophanes is mocking a very real trend that was sweeping through the Greek world.
He is making fun of these Ionian philosophers and independent experts who were coming into towns, looking at everyday agricultural practices that have been going on for hundreds of years, and suddenly claiming they hold secret cosmic truths that only the literate class could decode.
What Aristophanes is reacting to is the colonization of everyday practice by the textual specialists. They are taking something deeply practical and local and forcibly imposing a universal abstract meaning on top of it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it is not just satire. We have physical proof of this intellectual gatekeeping happening in reality. The source mentions a fascinating artifact called the Dervini Papyrus.
The Dervini Papyrus is one of the most vital discoveries for understanding this shift. It is an ancient Greek papyrus roll found in a tomb dating back to the time of Philip of Macedon. It contains a philosophical treatise written by an Orphic priest or diviner.
And the sheer arrogance of the author is staggering. This divinatory priest explicitly criticizes normal people for doing rituals blindly. He writes about the common public performing sacrifices, and he claims that because they do not understand the hidden cosmological allegory behind the physical actions, their sacrifices are completely useless.
The farmer thinks he is feeding the gods, maintaining the social ledger, and protecting his crops.
But the priest with the scroll tells him, no, your physical action is worthless because you do not have the correct intellectual understanding of the ritual.
It is the ultimate form of intellectual gatekeeping. The specialist is boldly declaring, your physical actions have no inherent value without my textual interpretation. He is creating a dependency.
He is inserting himself as the mandatory middleman between the farmer and the unseen world.
This ancient intellectual snobbery connects to a massive historical pivot. We're talking about the eventual total replacement of physical ritual with texts, the textualization of religion.
This is what Stowers calls the triumph of mind over matter. The literate specialists eventually succeeded in textualizing sacrifice altogether.
Over centuries, they shifted the definition of worship from a physical act in the dirt involving animals and fire to a matter of inner truths, correct intellectual beliefs, and the study of written texts. The mind replaced the altar.
The source cites the Apostle Paul to illustrate this mind-mental shift, specifically his words in Romans chapter 12. Paul urges his followers to present their bodies as a living sacrifice, which he calls their rational worship or spiritual worship, depending on the translation.
Now, looking at this historically through Stowers' framework, Paul is utilizing the vocabulary of the everyday social exchange, the physical sacrifice, and completely bypassing the external offering of animals.
He is taking the concept and moving it entirely into the realm of the renewed mind and the internal disposition toward a universal transcendent God.
From a historical and sociological perspective, Paul's rhetoric is a masterful example of this shift. He is redefining the parameters of engagement.
The action is no longer an external physical barbecue meant to appease a localized spirit. It is an internal, cognitive, and holistic surrender of the self.
The mind and the living body become the site of the sacrifice, guided by theological truth rather than practical appeasement.
And we see this shift away from the physical altar happening outside of Christianity as well. The source highlights the rabbinic tradition that developed after the destruction of the Judean temple in 70 A.D. by the Romans.
Before the destruction, the temple was the center of a massive, bloody, exhausting physical reality. Priests were slaughtering thousands of animals. It was a massive logistical and physical operation.
But when the temple falls, the physical altar is gone. The rabbis do not just give up and disappear. They create an imaginative, highly resilient, portable religion.
The rabbinic solution is one of the most remarkable adaptations in history. Since they could no longer physically sacrifice the animals, they determined that studying the texts about the sacrifices became the substitute for the sacrifices themselves.
The intellectual activity of reading and debating the law replaced the physical activity of the slaughter.
It is like replacing a physical handshake deal with reading a massive legal contract.
The physical interaction is gone, replaced entirely by the activity of the mind. You do not shake hands anymore. You just gather together and read the clause about the handshake.
But this raises a major mechanical question for me. Did the average people just accept this?
Did the farmers, the tradesmen, the vast majority of the population just give up their festive meals, drop their local traditions, and say, cool, I will just go listen to a guy read a scroll instead? Because human nature does not usually change that quickly.
That is the crucial reality check of Stowers' paper.
Yeah.
The everyday religion never fully disappeared. The fundamental human desire to manage the uncertain world through physical action remained.
People still needed rain. They still had mice in their grain. They still wanted to share physical meals to build social bonds.
The 98% did not simply become philosophers overnight. Instead of the everyday practices disappearing, the literate specialists aligned with political leaders to create structural overlays.
They built institutional frameworks that forced the two differing modes to coexist.
Structural overlays. This brings us to Stowers' final two modes, which are political structures sitting on top of the foundation we have discussed.
Mode 3 is civic religion, often called polis religion. Mode 4 is the religion of literate specialists tied to actual institutional political power. Let's look at civic religion first. How did the politicians utilize the barbecue?
In civic religion, the local landowners, the aristocrats, and the city magistrates took the everyday, localized farm practices and centralized them.
They scaled up the neighborhood barbecue into massive, citywide festivals funded by the state.
And in doing so, they reimagined the gods. The gods were no longer just moody, unpredictable entities lingering outside the farmhouse window. They were rebranded strictly as benevolent, patriotic patrons of the city-state.
They took the local spirits and turned them into city mascots.
The state co-opted the everyday practices to build civic unity and reinforce social hierarchies. The local landowner brings his offering to the central temple, the state officials oversee the massive slaughter, and the meat is distributed to the citizens.
It satisfies the common person's desire for a festive meal and physical ritual, while simultaneously demonstrating the power and generosity of the political elite.
The ritual is no longer just about feeding a local spirit. It is about declaring loyalty to Athens or Rome or Ephesus.
That explains how the politicians managed it. But Mode 4 is where the literate specialists finally get their hands on the actual levers of power. We see this vividly in the early Christian church as it became institutionalized within the Roman Empire, particularly after Constantine.
The specialists, the theologians and bishops, gained real political and institutional authority. They had the backing of the state to enforce their textual interpretations.
What's fascinating here is how this tension played out on the ground between the elites and the common people. Stowers uses a concept developed by historian Ramsay MacMullen to illustrate this dynamic.
MacMullen talks about the phenomenon of the first and second churches.
I found this image to be one of the most compelling parts of the entire deep dive. Break down the difference between the first and second churches for us.
The first church refers to the official, institutional structure. This was the domain of the clergy, the literate elites, the bishops, and the wealthy property owners.
They worshipped inside the physical basilica.
Their religious practice was focused entirely on high-minded theological concepts, correct doctrine, the reading of scripture, and the delivery of complex sermons.
The realm of the mind, the domain of the 2% who could read the texts and debate the theology.
Yes, but the second church was located physically outside those walls. It was out in the cemeteries and the rural shrines.
The masses of average people, the 98%, were still out there practicing a modified version of everyday social exchange.
They were holding feasts at the graves of dead martyrs. They were seeking local miracles. They were leaving physical offerings at shrines, hoping for agricultural blessings or physical healing.
They took the new figures of the Christian era, the saints and the martyrs, and treated them exactly like the localized interested parties from the old pagan everyday religion.
From a theological perspective, we recognize this immediately as the human heart's stubborn tendency toward works-based appeasement.
They just swapped the names on the jars in the storeroom. Instead of Zeus of the possessions keeping the mice away, it became Saint So-and-so keeping the mice away.
Instead of leaving a piece of meat for a local daemon, they poured out wine on a martyr's tomb to get a favor. The physical practice of reciprocity, the attempt to manage the local environment through appeasement, remained identical.
The tension this created must have been incredible.
The historical records show it was a source of massive frustration for the church fathers. You have the specialists inside the basilica, constantly writing treatises, trying to enforce the right meanings of rituals, preaching about abstract theology and the spiritual nature of worship.
And right outside the walls, the average person is holding a loud, drunken feast on a tomb to secure a good harvest.
The specialists looked down on the physical, local practices as crude, ignorant, or even demonic, while the people were just trying to use the tools they understood to survive the uncertainties of life.
It is a perpetual tug of war. The elite constantly trying to textualize and intellectualize practice, and the masses continually returning to localized physical reciprocity. The elite write the rules, but the common people live the reality.
And because the elite wrote the history books, for centuries, modern scholars assumed that the abstract, theological version of religion was the only one that truly mattered, even in antiquity. We adopted the biases of the 2%.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize this entire deep dive into Stowers' research, ancient sacrifice was not a dramatic, guilt-ridden theological event for the vast majority of people.
It was a practical, reciprocal meal with the local divine neighbors. You give a little food, you get a little protection. It was a management strategy for an unpredictable world.
It was only when a tiny fraction of literate specialists gained control of the historical record and later gained political power that the concept of religion became universally defined by hidden meanings, texts, and internal beliefs.
The framework we use to judge the past was built by the few guys who read the scrolls, and they used that framework to declare that the practical habits of everyone else were invalid.
The physical act of the common people was hijacked by the textual interpretation of the elite. The medium of writing itself altered our historical perception of human practice.
Which leaves us with a massive realization. Since almost all of human history is recorded by that 2% of literate specialists, our entire modern secular definition of religion, the assumption that it always requires a set of intellectual beliefs, a holy book, and a systematic theology, is heavily biased by the medium of writing itself.
We have been seeing the past through the glasses of the people who held the pens. We assume theology always preceded practice, when in reality, for most of human history, the physical practice was all there was.
It forces us to question how much of our own behavior we judge through an artificial, highly intellectualized lens. We are conditioned to search for deep, symbolic meaning in every action.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we close. Are there parts of your own daily life that you over-intellectualize just to give them a supposed meaning, when really they're simply practical habits designed to keep your local world running smoothly? Do you invent a complex philosophy for why you arrange your desk a certain way or why you take a specific route to work when really it just feels right and gets the job done? We love to construct elaborate rationalizations for our routines, just like the ancient specialists did, but sometimes a habit is just a habit, and sometimes a meal is just a meal. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.